I remember the smell of rain, sharp and familiar, like the breath of a world reborn. That scent, it always meant something was about to change. For Mira, the first hint of it came as she stood alone at the edge of an old cobblestone plaza, the stones uneven and worn smooth by centuries of footfalls. It was the kind of place that seemed to hum with forgotten footsteps, layered with the stories of those who had passed through but never truly left. She stood beneath a flickering street lamp, watching the way the mist curled beneath its glow like fingers too tired to hold on. The sky had begun to bruise at the horizon, a deep indigo spilling across the edges of pale orange, and the first drops of rain fell not with violence but with reverence, like the earth was being baptized again. She didn't flinch. She tilted her head up, eyes closed, letting the droplets kiss her cheeks, each one a soft question she didn't yet know how to answer. She had arrived in the city not by accident, though she told herself she wasn't sure why she'd come. In truth, something had pulled her, a tug she had felt ever since she was a child, listening to her grandmother's stories whispered in candlelight. They were stories filled with doorways hidden in walls, with voices trapped in mirrors, with places that remembered people long after they were gone. Her grandmother used to say, some cities keep their secrets close, but some, they leave breadcrumbs for those willing to follow. Mira had followed. Across 2 trains and a bus, down winding streets and alleyways too narrow for cars, with only a photograph and a half-burned letter tucked into her coat. In that photo, a younger version of her grandmother stood in front of a fountain she'd never seen in any travel book. The letter was unsigned, water-stained, and fragmented, but the words that remained burned into her memory. If you find it, if you truly listen, the city will speak back. Now, here she was, feet aching, heart pounding, soaked suitcase at her side like a loyal dog too stubborn to turn back. The plaza was quiet except for the patter of rain and the faint creak of shutters closing for the night. Lanterns above the shops flickered on one by one, their warm orange glow turning the wet cobblestones into rivers of light. Something about the moment felt suspended, like time itself had paused to watch her. Mira took a slow breath. The air was thick with possibility. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the plaza, and as she did, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No flash of lightning, no voice from the heavens, just a subtle pull in her chest, like the city had inhaled, acknowledged her, and was now waiting. She turned slowly, scanning every corner. To her left, a bakery, closed now, but the scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. To her right, a worn statue of a woman with ivy tangled in her stone hair. Directly ahead, a staircase descending into shadows, the kind of place tourists avoid but locals know too well. The rain thickened, no longer polite, drumming against her coat. Still, she didn't move. Not yet. She wanted to remember this moment exactly, how the light spilled across the puddles like ink from a cracked bottle, how the sound of rain hitting metal awnings made a kind of music, how the city seemed to pulse with breath. It was watching her of that she was sure. Not in a menacing way. No, this place watched the way a library does, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right page to be turned. She knelt beside her suitcase, pulled out the letter again, and read the last line once more. The path appears only when you walk it. Mira smiled. Not everything needed to be understood to be real. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into the back of her journal, and stood. Her shoes slipped slightly on the wet stones, but she caught herself. The plaza's air was no longer heavy, it felt expectant, like a stage just before the curtain rises. She looked toward the staircase, heart-thudding. Her hand instinctively touched the silver chain around her neck, the one holding her grandmother's ring, worn smooth by years of turning it in nervous fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a chime rang. Not a church bell. Not a clock. Something subtler, like wind whispering through glass. Mira felt it more than she heard it. A sign. An invitation. She took a step toward the staircase. Then another. The city did not resist. And as she descended into the shadows, guided only by the faint promise of memory and rain, the plaza behind her exhaled, its lanterns flickering in approval. Underscore 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 underscore. The bookstore wasn't on any map. That was the first sign that it was meant to be found, not looked for. Mira had wandered down a narrow alley lined with ivy and rust, chasing a whisper she couldn't quite name. The rain had slowed to a misty drizzle, enough to blur the edges of things, enough to make reality feel just a bit more flexible. A crooked sign above a wooden door reads simply, Veritas. No hours. No slogan. Just that one word carved into weathered oak as though it had always been there. Mira reached out, but before her fingers could touch the handle, the door creaked open inward, revealing a corridor wrapped in shadows and warmth. The smell was the first thing to strike her, a heady blend of old paper, beeswax, cedar, and something deeper, like forgotten dreams. She stepped inside. The city vanished behind her. It didn't feel like stepping into a shop. It felt like crossing a threshold between one version of herself and another. The hush inside wasn't silent, it was attentive, as if the walls were listening. The bookstore was narrow but impossibly long. Shelves stretched toward the ceiling, packed tightly with volumes of all sizes and languages. Some were leather-bound tomes with golden edges. Others were so thin and delicate they seemed likely to dissolve under breath. There were no obvious categories, no genres, no signs. Just books. Endless, breathing books. They seemed to lean toward her as she walked past, as if curious about her arrival. To her right, an old phonograph played something distant, soft jazz, or perhaps a lullaby from a forgotten century. Light filtered through stained glass windows set high in the walls, painting the air in fractured color. There were no other customers, no cash register, just a single desk at the far end, where a man sat hunched over a handwritten ledger. He did not look up immediately. He had hair the color of ash and wore a waistcoat patched at the elbows. Beside him stood a silver kettle and 2 cups, as though he'd been waiting for someone. Mira took a tentative step forward, and only then did he look up. "You found it," he said simply, his voice worn smooth with age. "I wasn't looking," she replied. He smiled just barely. "That's usually how it works." She wanted to ask what it was. The shop? The book? The city? But something in his eyes suggested the question was premature. He gestured for her to sit across from him. She did. Without asking, he poured her tea. It smelled of lavender and lemon rind. She sipped cautiously, expecting heat. It was warm, not hot, perfect, as though it had been waiting for her mouth. The warmth spread through her chest like memory. She felt herself relax just a little. He slid a small black book across the desk. It had no title, no author. Just a symbol on the front, the same circle within a square she'd seen on the door earlier. "What is this?" she asked. "A key," he said. "But only if you read it with both your eyes and your silence." Mira blinked. "Silence? The part of you that doesn't speak," he clarified. "The part that listens." She ran her fingers across the cover. It felt alive, warm, as though it had been resting under a sun that no longer existed. She opened the book to the first page. It was blank. She turned another. Also blank. The third page held a single sentence, scrawled in faint ink that seemed to shimmer. It read, "To see the city, you must forget the map." Mira looked up. "What does that mean?" The man had already turned back to his ledger. "You'll understand when it's time," he said without looking. Pages rustled. A cat she hadn't seen jumped down from a high shelf, its fur silver and eyes mismatched. It rubbed against her legs, purring deeply. Mira closed the book and tucked it into her coat. She felt strangely protective of it already. "Do I owe you anything?" she asked. "Just attention," he replied. "And maybe one day a story of your own." She stood. The room felt slightly different now, brighter, somehow, or maybe she had adjusted to the gloom. Books no longer leaned toward her. They stood still, satisfied. She turned toward the door. The man's voice followed her. "Not everything that's lost wants to be found, but everything that's found wants to be remembered." She stepped outside. The door clicked softly shut behind her. The rain had stopped entirely, but the air still shimmered with moisture. She looked down the alley. The bookstore was gone. Only the silence remained. Underscore 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 underscore. Night fell slowly over the city like a heavy curtain drawn by unseen hands. Not in a rush, no, this city respected its rituals. The sky deepened by degrees, turning from steel gray to ink blue, pierced occasionally by the glow of lanterns flickering to life in shop windows, over doorways, and along crooked alleyways. Mira stepped out from where the bookstore had been. Was it minutes ago? Hours? Time had shifted inside Veritas. The air now was thick with a kind of quiet magic, the kind that tingled just beneath the skin and made every shadow seem deliberate. In her coat pocket, the small black book nestled like a second heartbeat. She hadn't opened it again, not yet. She knew instinctively that it would only reveal what she was ready to receive. She didn't know where she was going. There was no street name, no signs. But her feet knew something she didn't. They moved on their own, guided not by memory but by momentum. The stones under her boots were slick with rain, reflecting the yellow glow of lanterns in broken fragments. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet leaves laced with something floral that had no obvious source. A single bell rang in the distance. Not a church bell, this was softer, rounder, like it belonged to a clock that measured moments instead of hours. She turned left down an alley where the walls leaned in so close she could touch both at once. A child's chalk drawings covered the bricks here, suns with too many rays, stick figures with wings, swirling spirals like galaxies drawn by uncertain hands. Mira felt watched but not threatened. The city wasn't hiding from her. It was showing itself, piece by piece. Every corner she turned offered something. A shuttered bakery with glowing embers still visible in the oven. A courtyard filled with abandoned bird cages swinging gently in the breeze. A glass bottle perched perfectly upright on a windowsill with a single white feather inside. None of it made sense. All of it felt important. She found herself at a canal without realizing she'd walked toward water. The canal was narrow, more like a vein than a river, and the buildings that flanked it looked older than any she'd seen so far. They leaned forward as if eavesdropping on the water's secrets. A gondola floated nearby, unmanned, tethered to a rusted ring in the stone. Mira paused at the edge, unsure whether to follow the path or step aboard. As she hesitated, the book in her coat warmed again. She pulled it out and opened it without thinking. This time, the page was filled with writing, not printed, but scrawled in familiar handwriting. Her grandmother's. There are paths the eyes cannot follow. Trust your weight. Let your body answer the question before your mind understands it's being asked. She looked up. The gondola bobbed once, then twice, as though agreeing. Mira stepped aboard. It didn't rock or shift under her weight, it simply accepted her. The rope slipped free on its own. With no visible hand, the boat began to glide. Slowly, smoothly, the city passed by in silence, buildings blurred by candlelit shadows. Behind tall windows, she saw hints of life, shapes moving behind curtains, the flicker of a projector casting black and white films onto crumbling plaster walls, someone playing a cello in a room lit only by mirrors. None of them looked at her. None acknowledged her passage. But she felt seen. The way a story sees its reader. The way a song hears the heart. The gondola curved left, then right, moving as if pulled by memory. She passed under a low bridge carved with names she could barely make out. One name caught her eye, Aurelia, her grandmother's name. Beneath it, a date, 1964. Mira's breath caught. She reached for her book. Another page had appeared. I stood here too, wondering if I was mad or if the world had finally begun to make sense. Mira's eyes burned with sudden tears. She wasn't just chasing a story anymore, she was inside one that had already started long before she was born. The gondola turned again, and this time the buildings thinned out. Trees rose on either side, their branches arching over the canal like a cathedral. The moon broke through the clouds above, scattering silver across the water. In the distance, she saw a building tall, dark, with windows like closed eyes. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, vines thick along its stone frame, a weathered door barely hanging on its hinges. The gondola slowed, bumping softly against a mossy dock. Mira stepped out. The boat drifted back into the mist and vanished. She looked up at the building. Something in her chest told her she'd arrived, not at a destination, but at a beginning. The black book trembled slightly in her hand. She opened it. One sentence. The door only opens for those who carry more questions than answers. She placed her palm on the door. And waited. Underscore 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 underscore. The building towered before her like a memory trying to return. Vines clung to its walls like secrets refusing to let go, thick and wild, threading across crumbling stone with the deliberate patience of something that had never been told no. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, but Mira didn't believe in such things anymore. The absence of noise was not emptiness, but reverence. The tall windows, clouded with dust and age, stared down at her like lidded eyes in quiet judgment. The door, warped with weather and years of silence, bore no handle, only a symbol carved deeply into its grain, a circle within a square, just like on the cover of the black book. She reached into her coat, fingers brushing against the now familiar leather. The book thudded against her palm with a slow, steady pulse, warm again, as if urging her forward. She placed her hand on the door, half expecting resistance. But it opened easily, silently, as though it had been waiting. Specifically for her, for this moment, this lifetime. She stepped into the darkness, and the world hushed even further. Inside, the air was thicker. Not with dust or decay, but with history. She could taste it. The passageway narrowed almost immediately, guiding her forward through a corridor of old mirrors, tall and mismatched, mounted at uneven intervals along the walls. Their glass was aged, fogged, and graying at the edges, the kind that doesn't show your reflection so much as reveal something else hiding beneath it. As she walked past the first, she caught a glimpse, not of herself, but of a girl younger than her by years, barefoot and laughing in a field of poppies. Mira stopped, turned back. The image vanished. The mirror now showed only her pale, slightly damp from the rain, eyes wide not with fear, but something stranger. Recognition. She moved on. The next mirror rippled as she passed. This time she saw her grandmother. Young, vibrant, hair coiled in perfect 1940s waves, standing on a balcony Mira didn't recognize. Behind her in the reflection, a door opened into nothing but stars. One after another, the mirrors whispered truths and fictions until she couldn't tell which was which. Sometimes they showed her strangers, sometimes people she had loved. One showed her a version of herself much older, seated at a desk surrounded by maps, writing furiously in a language she didn't know yet. Another showed her alone on the same gondola, but this time without a city, just endless water and sky. She wanted to stop, to turn and study each, but the hallway wouldn't allow it. It pulsed behind her like a breath, gently urging her forward. She felt as though she were walking deeper into a dream, one she hadn't known she'd been dreaming since birth. The hallway spilled into a circular room at the building's center. The ceiling arched high above her, lost in darkness, and lanterns floated midair like stars suspended in molasses. Shelves lined the curved walls. Books again, but these were stranger. They were wrapped in cloth, in leaves, in stone. Some had no spines at all. One shelf was filled entirely with jars of ink, each labeled with a different emotion. Longing, remorse, first wonder, joy on the seventh day. There was no dust, no cobwebs. This place was not abandoned, it was waiting. At the center of the room stood a pedestal made of obsidian, and on it a single closed book. Not black, not like hers. This one shimmered with color, constantly shifting, now red, now violet, now something that had no name. She approached it slowly. Her fingers tingled. Before she could touch it, a voice echoed. Not loud, not human. It came from everywhere and nowhere, soft as thought. What do you seek? Mira opened her mouth, but no sound came. Not because she couldn't speak. Because she didn't know the answer. She looked down at the book in her hand. It opened itself. The pages flipped, faster than she could follow, then stopped. To find what you were not yet. Belonged to someone else. That's why you arrived, the woman answered. If you had known, the path would have disappeared. Mira stepped closer. The woman raised her hand. In it was a quill, not a pen, not a feather, but something stranger. It seemed carved from light itself. She held it out. Write, she said. Mira blinked. Write what? What has not yet happened, the woman said. What only exists if you name it. Mira took the quill. Her hand trembled slightly. The floor beneath her feet began to shift, the pages fluttering upward like birds disturbed from sleep. A single blank book rose from the ground, floating before her, its cover smooth as silence. She opened it. The pages waited. She looked at the woman, who nodded once. Mira took a breath, then another. Slowly, she placed the quill against the paper. The moment she touched it, the chamber changed. It filled with wind, not harsh, but steady, like the exhale of something enormous just beyond view. Words began to spill onto the page, not ones she consciously chose, but ones pulled from somewhere deeper. She wrote of doors and mirrors, of gondolas and vanished bookstores. She wrote of her grandmother, of chalk drawings, of cities hidden beneath cities. The quill danced across the page with a will of its own, Mira merely the vessel. Time melted. Her hand grew sore, her eyes wet, but she didn't stop. Not because she couldn't, but because stopping would mean forgetting, and she wasn't ready to let go. When she finally paused, the book snapped shut. The woman reached out and touched the cover. Immediately, it transformed into something else, a stone tablet, rough and old, inscribed with a single phrase, she remembered forward. The room dimmed. Mira looked around. The walls were retreating, peeling away like curtains drawn back from a stage. She stood now not in a chamber but on a ledge, high above a landscape that hadn't been there before. Below her spread a city, but not the one she had wandered through. This was brighter, stranger, alive in ways that defied logic. Buildings pulsed with color. Trees whispered stories into the wind. Roads curved not for function but for feeling. And the people, oh the people. They shimmered, every one of them outlined faintly with light, like they were more than flesh. Like they were ideas made real. Mira gasped. The woman beside her smiled. This is the city you've been writing, she said. And it remembers you. Mira turned. But what do I do now? Live in it, the woman said. Shape it. Or let it shape you. Walk through it until the ground learns your name. Mira closed her eyes. The book in her hands turned warm again. She stepped forward. And the city opened. Underscore 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 underscore. The city didn't open like a gate or a door, it bloomed. Mira stepped into it, and with every footfall, the world responded as if it had been holding its breath for her arrival. The air was electric, soft, and scented with something ancient, like paper left near. A window for a century, like time made tangible. The streets pulsed under her soles. Not asphalt, not stone. Something alive. Something woven. She walked forward without knowing the rules of this new place, and yet she wasn't lost. Buildings shimmered as though they were made from thought, not material. A house might bend toward her in greeting, its windows fluttering like eyelashes. Lamps blinked on not at nightfall, but when stories needed light. Street signs didn't bear names but memories, shifting depending on who looked at them. She passed one that read "Where I last saw her smile," and another simply "Before the storm." Mira didn't try to understand it anymore, she let it be what it was, and the city seemed to reward her for that surrender. People moved through the city, not hurried, not idle. They drifted like characters in a novel being written in real time. Each had a glow about them, not visible exactly, but undeniable. As Mira passed them, she caught fragments of their lives. Not by eavesdropping, but by something deeper. An old man sweeping his porch hummed a lullaby that summoned snowflakes that never touched the ground. A girl with silver hair chased a red kite that whispered names as it danced. A woman in a long blue coat walked into a wall and disappeared, not through a hidden door, but by folding herself into an idea too big to be explained. Mira found herself in a plaza where the buildings formed a perfect circle. At the center stood a fountain, not of water, but ink. It rippled without overflowing, perfectly still except for when someone approached. A boy stepped forward, dipped a finger into it, and wrote a name in the air. The name glowed, then dissolved like mist. A man followed, hesitated, then scrawled something much longer, a phrase, maybe a poem. It too vanished. Mira approached. The ink recognized her. It rippled before she even reached it. Her fingers trembled as she touched the surface. It felt like memory. She wrote one word, Aurelia. It hovered above her hand, shining gold, then folded inward and disappeared. The city shifted. A corridor opened that hadn't been there a moment before, arches made from ivy and lamplight, paths paved with old book spines. Mira walked through, the ground crunching softly beneath her. Along the walls, mirrors bloomed like flowers, revealing brief flashes of places she didn't yet know. A tower standing upside down. A library inside a clock. A train that moved only when no one looked directly at it. Then she saw her grandmother again, this time older, seated on a bench in a sunlit courtyard, reading from a book with no title. She looked up and smiled, not into the mirror, but directly at Mira, as if time had bent to let them meet across dimensions. Mira turned a corner and entered a space that felt like a cathedral made of stories. The ceiling arched impossibly high, its surface etched with constellations that changed shape when you blinked. Benches lined the room in spirals instead of rows. At the center stood a tree dead yet blooming. Its bark was silver, its leaves made of torn paper, and each one whispered a different language. Beneath it sat a figure draped in pages. Mira recognized them, not from her life, but from her dreams. This was the Storykeeper. Not a person, not a ghost, something in between. The Storykeeper lifted their head, revealing eyes that were blank and burning all at once. "You've written," they said. "But have you remembered?" Mira didn't answer. The question wasn't rhetorical, but it also wasn't pressing. It was a seed meant to grow in its own time. The Storykeeper gestured to the tree. "Every leaf here is something forgotten," they said. "We keep them safe until someone remembers." Mira stepped forward. One leaf drifted down and landed in her hand. It said the first promise she ever made was to herself. She looked up. More leaves fell, each unfolding a piece of something larger than her life. One whispered her grandmother's laugh. Another held the smell of the bookstore on a rainy morning. Another still bore the soft warmth of her mother's hand the day she almost ran away. These weren't just memories, they were truths. The kind she hadn't known she'd lost. The kind no photograph could ever hold. Tears slid down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but from recognition. This city didn't just remember stories. It was made of them, and she, somehow, was part of its foundation. Her grandmother had walked these roads, written these walls, sung to these leaves. Mira had always thought she was seeking a mystery, but she was the continuation of one. She looked to the Storykeeper. "What happens when I leave?" The Storykeeper tilted their head. "No one truly leaves. You carry the city with you. Some forget, others return. But it's always here, waiting beneath the world." Mira looked down at the leaf in her hand. The ink shimmered, then faded. In its place were 4 words. "It is your turn." Underscore 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 underscore. The streets were no longer unfamiliar. Mira walked now not as a stranger or a guest, but as someone who belonged, though not in the way belonging is often understood. She wasn't a citizen of this place. She was part of its breath, its memory. The city no longer shimmered with uncertainty, but with familiarity, like a dream returning each night in clearer form. Yet something had shifted again. The buildings that once whispered began to sing. Low, tonal hums followed her movements, not ominous, not even musical in the traditional sense, but resonant like the sound of old wood when rain hits its grain. The melodies weren't for her alone. They were part of the city speaking to itself, reminding each brick, each echo, that something had returned. Or awakened. She passed a street made entirely of thresholds, doorways with no walls between them, frames suspended in midair. People stepped through, disappearing into memories or emerging from dreams. Mira didn't walk through them. She watched. Some entered laughing and returned crying. Others vanished entirely. The city wasn't a test, it was a mirror. And each reflection changed depending on what you feared, or hoped, or loved. She followed the curve of an alley lined with wind chimes that played no sound, only releasing scent. Jasmine, old parchment, the sea. She turned another corner and stepped into a square she had never seen, yet recognized immediately. At its center stood a table set for one, under a canopy of tangled lanterns. On the table, the black book, the original. The one her grandmother had given her. She hadn't seen it in days, not since the descent into the mirrored chamber. Mira approached slowly. The lanterns flickered overhead, casting light that showed not just her shadow, but many. The child she had been, the woman she might yet become, the moments she had been brave, cruel, kind, lost. She sat. The chair was warm. The book opened on its own. This time, the pages were not written in her grandmother's hand, but her own. Words spilled across the page that she didn't recall writing, yet were undeniably hers. They described the city exactly as it was, but from the viewpoint of someone who had lived here for years. There were details she hadn't consciously noticed, like the way the river always curved to the left, or how every third building had a single tile made of bone. The words pulsed as she read them, lighting up like veins in a living thing. The book was no longer a guide. It had become a record, not of the past, but of what she had made real by witnessing it. Across the square, a second figure appeared. Not her grandmother this time. Not the Storykeeper, but a version of Mira, older, quieter, clothed in silence rather than time. She didn't speak. She only extended her hand. Mira rose, heart beating like a second drum inside her chest. She reached out, and when their palms touched, the square dissolved not into darkness, but into sky. Endless, painted sky. The world unraveled into color. Deep crimson, storm gold, twilight blue. They stood together on a plain of shifting clouds. The older Mira, this echo of the future, nodded and let go. She began to walk away, and as she did, her form fragmented into pages, hundreds of them, each drifting upward into the heavens like birds released. Mira stood alone, but not empty. The sky transformed again. This time it became a canvas, a massive circular dome filled with the symbols she had encountered since the beginning, the circle in the square, the compass without needles, the door drawn in chalk. They spun slowly above her, not as prophecies or omens, but as reminders. This was not the end of the journey. This was the point where the map folds inward and becomes the terrain itself. A final path emerged beneath her feet, paved with stone, but each stone etched with a date she had forgotten. Her 7th birthday. The day she first saw snow. The moment she understood someone she loved had lied. The first time she forgave herself. She walked it barefoot now. The warmth of memory rising through her soles. Ahead stood a gate, tall, shimmering, wrapped in ivy and clock hands ticking out of sync. It was not locked. It had never been locked. It only waited for her to be ready to open it. She reached it. On the gate's surface were carved 3 simple words. Bring it back. Mira paused. She understood. This place was never meant to be kept. It was to be remembered, shared. Not by explanation, but by story. She turned the handle and stepped through. Mira stepped through the gate and the world changed. Not in a way that was loud or visible, but in a way that rearranged the essence of everything she had ever known. There was no flash, no music, no violent shift. Instead, the transformation was quiet, like waking from a dream and realizing the dream had followed you back. She was standing in the same alley where it all began, surrounded by the same dull brick, the same closed shops, the same old bookstore with its faded lettering and dusty window. But nothing was the same. The city she had just walked through, the living place made of story and memory and time, was not gone. It was under the surface, pulsing faintly, quietly, like a heartbeat under stone. The air held the faintest echo of lantern light and ink. Mira blinked, touched the book still in her hands. It was there, small now, leather-bound, humming faintly with warmth. She opened it. The pages were blank. Every one. Not because the story had disappeared, but because it was no longer trapped. It was inside her now. She stepped out into the street. The world was louder than she remembered. Car horns. Passing conversations. A bus exhaling. But beneath the surface of each sound, she could hear it, the rhythm of the other city. Of that city, the one few people knew existed. The one hidden beneath memory and imagination. The one made from forgotten songs and the names people whispered only in dreams. She looked around. Nothing had changed. And everything had. The world had color again, not brighter, exactly, but truer. She could see the stories written into every surface. The cracks in the pavement were the lines of old poems. The graffiti was a cry from someone trying to be remembered. A wind moved through the trees with a hush like pages turning. She walked past people with their heads bowed to their phones, their faces pale with routine. She wanted to grab them and shake them and shout, "Don't you see it? Don't you hear it? The world is made of stories." But she didn't. Not yet. Because that wasn't the way. She passed a child drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. The child looked up, smiled at Mira, and drew a circle. Then a square inside it. Then a line across both. Mira stopped, stunned. The child winked and kept drawing. She knows, Mira thought. She remembers. Or maybe she never forgot. She reached the bookstore. It was open now. The door creaked as she pushed it. Inside, the dust swirled like soft snow. Everything looked the same, towering stacks, crooked shelves, that same green lamp flickering in the corner. But behind the counter stood someone new. An older man with ink-stained fingers and eyes like storm glass. He looked up, nodded once and said, "Took you long enough." Mira blinked. "You were expecting me?" she asked. "We're always expecting you," he replied. "Everyone who goes there. They all come back different. And the city remembers." He reached under the counter and handed her a small card. On it were the words, Archivist in Residence. Below that her name. Just her first name. That was enough. What do I do now? She whispered. You help them remember, he said. Not by telling them. Not directly. But by giving them something that wakes it up inside them. A story. A moment. A nudge. Sometimes all it takes is a single word in the right voice. Mira looked at the shelves. Books trembled faintly. Some glowed. Others whispered. A few had no covers at all, just impressions like fingerprints left in fog. She reached for one. It felt alive. She opened it. The words danced literal, moving across the page like choreographed thought. This was her new work. Not to escape into stories, but to return them. To give them back. To become the bridge. She spent that afternoon helping an old woman find a poem she once knew as a child but had forgotten after losing her sister. She spent the next morning curating a stack of books for a teenager who said he hated reading but stayed for 3 hours because something felt right in here. At night, she wrote not for herself, but for the city beneath the world. She fed it with her ink, and in return, it whispered its next chapters to her in dreams. Seasons turned. Mira grew. She changed, but not away from herself into herself. The bookstore became a portal for others. Not visibly, not obviously. But you could tell when someone walked and lost and left with something more than paper. You could tell when someone remembered the shape of the gate, or dreamed of ink that never dried. Sometimes a visitor would pause, look around, and ask, have I been here before? Mira would smile and say, you've always been here. And once, just once, she woke in the middle of the night, drawn to the back room of the shop. A single book had fallen off the shelf. When she picked it up, the pages weren't blank. They were filled with her grandmother's handwriting again. The story was still being written. Not in the past tense, but in present, in becoming. Mira stood at the threshold, book in hand, the scent of stories all around her. She stepped outside. The city stretched in every direction. Not the old city. Both cities. The one above and the one below. The remembered and the forgotten. The real and the more real. Somewhere, bells rang. A child drew a symbol in chalk. A story turned its page. Mira whispered, I remember. And the wind answered, welcome back.